So welcome to the session on amplifying the S in ESG. Today we have two very accomplished professors at our session. We have Professor Padmini Srinivasan, who's a chairperson of the CCGS, and Professor Vasanthi, who was a former chairperson of CCGC, and Professor of OB and HR. A very warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, Mr. Narayanan, a friend of IIMB, Ms. Madhura Mitra, Mr. Rajesh, and Mr. Alok Kumar. Welcome to our session. A few words on CCGS, the Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability, formerly known as Corporate Governance and Citizenship. IIMB was established in the year 2003. So we are, as of this year, 20 years old, and we have introduced ESG to our brand name, and that is why this is one of these webinars that we are holding in that subject. The center is accredited as the National Center of Excellence by NFCG, Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Government of India. The focus of the center falls under five broad areas: advocacy, education, training, research, and dissemination. The center is leading the way in advancing the state of knowledge in the field of corporate governance for young leaders through the Young Directors Forum. Participants who are interested in knowing more about the conference program can get in touch with Ganeshan. Registrations for 2004 have already begun. With that, I hand you over to Professor Padmini, who will introduce the speakers, and then on to Professor Vasanthi as the moderator of the session.
Yeah, thanks, Greta, for that introduction. Welcome to all the attendees on the webinar and also to the panelists. Very quickly, because this is a very, very interesting topic and a very hot topic, and we have a very, very, what shall I say, a panelist who, generally need no introduction, but I think you're all experts in this field. And today's topic, like I said, is very interesting. So let me very quickly get to this very brief introduction, and I'll then hand over the mic to Professor Vasanthi. So, Mr. P.S. Narayan is the Global Head of Sustainability and Social Initiative of Wipro Limited. He is also the Managing Trustee and Head of Wipro Foundation, the social initiative arm of Wipro Limited. He was instrumental in creation of Wipro's sustainability program and has stewarded it since its inception in 2008. Welcome, Mr. Narayan. I'm just keeping it brief because we all want to hear more about the topic. Thanks for taking time out.
Thank you very
Ms.
much.
Madhura, thank you. Ms. Madhura is the Executive Director of Sustainability and Climate Change of PwC India. I think one of the interesting aspects of this is she also works in the area of net zero decarbonization strategy for corporates, carbon inventory and target setting, scope, climate disclosures, and so on, having more than 15 years of experience in this area. Welcome, Madhura, for the webinar. Thanks for taking time out.
Thank you.
We also have Mr. Rajesh. He is the Director, CSR and Sustainability India and Southwest Asia of Coca-Cola Company. And Mr. Rajesh is the Director at present with over 24 years of professional experience across various roles and many organizations. He also manages and heads large-scale projects across multiple areas of sustainability, CSR, and so on. So welcome, Mr. Rajesh, to this webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Mr. Alok Kumar is the Managing Director and Head Global Analytics Services of Moody's RMS. Alok is the Head of Global Analytics, like I said, and he's part of the senior leadership team at Moody's, a California-based risk management company. He's a global professional with more than 20 years of experience, multicultural, multifunctional experience in insurance industry, and so on. Thanks, Alok, for taking time out and addressing and being part of this important webinar.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. We have with us Professor Vasanthi, and Professor Vasanthi is quite well known in the industry from OBHR area at IIM Bangalore. She's very passionate about today's subject And her research areas of interest are multi-generations in workspace, women in management, board ethics, and so on. And more importantly, the S part of ESG. She's been working in this area, including diversity and inclusion with many corporates, Indian multinationals, with business schools and so on in this area. Thanks, Vasanthi. I think all panelists are very busy people, and thanks for taking time out to this CCGS conference. Over to you, Vasanthi, for moderating the panel. Unmute yourself, please.
Yeah. Thanks, and thank you, Padmini, for that warm introduction. And what I'm going to do is plunge in directly into the session, because I think every minute on the S is precious. At the outset, I'm going to start with a February 2022 Stanford Social Innovation Review article, which starts with fixing the S in ESG. And the article starts with saying, is the planet really more important than the people? I think if we look at today's topic for this panel discussion, which is amplifying the S in ESG, we're going to begin with just asking what is S? And then, of course, the nice word there at the end of the panel discussion topic is net zero. And so it'll be interesting to listen to the panelists on how they look at net zero. So a 2021 global ESG survey by BNP Paribas revealed that 51% of the investors surveyed, covering 356 institutions, found the S to be the most difficult to analyze and embed in investment strategies. The report concluded that data is more difficult to come by, and there is an acute lack of standardization around social metrics. Investors have been willing to accept data that does little to actually assess the social performance of the companies in which they invest. So, for the investors, is S nothing more than a checkbox exercise? And should investors lead the way in looking at ESG more meaningfully? And it is in this context that I'm going to invite, given that there is a lack of clarity in terms of definition itself, I'm going to invite the panelists to first talk about how have they defined the S in ESG. Let me begin with the practitioners, because I think they really grapple with these issues at the ground level. And let me invite Mr. Narayan first, followed by Mr. Rajesh, to share with us their experiences in translating the S in ESG. Over to you, Narayan.
Thank you, Vasanthi. As always, great pleasure to be part of any IMB seminar. I think if you go back to the earlier avatar of ESG, which is what you referred to in the Stanford, paper, which is people, planet, and profit. The people angle was much more relatable than social. Social can be confusing. Social can also be social media, right? So if you go back to that, then and if you go into the depth of the triple bottom line, people was actually not a separate pillar, but it was a common cross-cutting theme across, right? So taking that as the anchor, if you look at a company like ours, which is an IT services organization, Wipro, S or people is about employees, of course, but it's also about the extended workforce, not just about core employees, very importantly. It's about customers, it's about suppliers, and it's about communities, right? All of these clearly come under S or people. And I think there are 2-3 common underlying thematic dimensions on this, which really center around, engaging with, enabling, and empowering people in whatever context that may be, right? That's part one of this whole S or people thing. But if you look at the interconnections of S with E and G, right, that's also there for you to discover, there for you to really bring out in the way you define and run your programs. Take renewable energy, for example. Most companies which have targets on renewable energy as part of the net zero program, including us. One of the clauses that we are insisting on contracts with our renewable energy suppliers is about, what happens upstream during, let's say, the land acquisition process. Are people's rights being protected and so on, right? So that's one. Look at the other dimension of G, governance, right? Where the most common governance principles of, let's say, codes of ethics in a company, right? Codes of ethics is really about values and what people do as part of their daily lived experience in that company. It's about, whether you have an effective whistleblower policy or an ombudsman process policy, not just for employees, but for suppliers, even for customers, and so on. So I think, the people web is sort of all over, right? The dimensions are all interconnected, and it is for the company to really bring that out in ways that bring to life the people element, whether it's E, S, or G.
Thanks, Narayan. Thank you. Very well said. And let's just go and listen to Rajesh from Coca-Cola. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Vasanthi. So, see, in recent years, the importance of ESG factors in investment decisions has gained significant traction. While the focus has been predominantly on the environmental aspects, particularly achieving net zero emissions, as you mentioned, it's also very crucial to recognize that the S, or social dimension of ESG, is equally significant. Moving from a net zero approach to a broader net impact perspective can actually help companies address social challenges and create lasting positive change. Investors are increasingly demanding transparency and accountability regarding the company's impact on the environment, social, and governance practices. While the E aspect has traditionally garnered more attention, the social component is now gaining more prominence as companies recognize the interdependence between social factors and long-term business success. Net impact takes the S in ESG beyond the boundaries of compliances and philanthropy. It encourages companies to proactively address social challenges and make a positive difference in the communities they operate in. This approach involves measuring and managing the broader social impacts of business activities, such as employee well-being, diversity, and inclusion, but taking that beyond into our supply chain practices and community engagement. So I think as an opening remark from a company perspective, that is how we are looking at S as a growingly important part of our business agenda.
Thanks. Thank you, Rajesh. And from there, we will go to listen to Madhura, who works across organizations in this area, and with her experience with working on environment and climate issues. How do you see the S as it gets operationalized at an organization sector level? And how are you as an advisory firm looking at this dimension?
Sure, thank you. I will just share a few practical, experiences that I've gained. First of all, when we talk about net zero, we are trying to mean that we will, balance out all our remaining emissions either by 2050, which is a recommendation by IPCC, or by 2070 as the country has targeted. But what essentially it means that we are trying to come out of the coal value chain, right? There will be lesser coal or no more coal. Then what happens to the millions of workers who are depending on the coal value chain? What happens to the society, that is depending on the coal value chain? Are they ready for this transition? So the whole aspect of justice, while transitioning from a coal-based economy to an economy which will be mainly driven by net zero, we must actually, carve out the roadmap in a manner so that everyone is there. We cannot move. This is not a journey by the corporates alone. This is not a journey by the consultants alone. We have to take everyone together. So that inclusion has to happen, and that justice has to serve. We need to serve the justice. So from that perspective, society plays a very important role. So that is from the perspective of when we talk about net zero or mitigation of emissions. The other aspect that I'd like to touch upon even more, while we discuss, that is of climate change adaptation. See, we are trying to mitigate our emissions because we would like to prevent all the hazards that are there, that are impending. But we have already reached 1.1 degrees Celsius, global average temperature, which we are trying to restrict, till 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which means that the hazards are bound to happen. We can't avoid them. So then in order to do that, how do we adapt? Because if we adapt to certain climate hazards, it's mainly we are looking at the hydrology over a region, right? Which means that we are looking at a water basin. We're looking at all the ponds, or the groundwater, the surface water within a water basin. The moment we talk about a water basin, we talk about everyone who resides in that water basin, which means we cannot adopt also without this society. Neither we can mitigate nor we can adopt without this society. So S from that perspective stands for the entire journey that we are going to take forward, in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So that's how I would start, and I'll come back to all the other details.
Great. Last but not the least, from Alok, coming from a rating agency, what are your perspectives on how you are looking at S today?
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me here. So while I work for a firm that's known to be a rating agency, I belong to the other business, which is completely disconnected with the rating business. So that's the disclaimer part of it. When we think about being socially responsible, for us, it translates essentially into three things. One is this constant work towards building a better business, and we do that through embedding principled and sustainable decision making in our corporate behavior, in our operations, and across the value chain. Then it's about building better lives, right? Better lives by fostering a nurturing and inclusive environment, not just for our employees, but also for the communities that we are part of. And third one is building better solutions. We are providing solution to the industry, particularly around risk management need, and the risks are constantly evolving in the current world. So we strive to constantly think about how do we come out with a solution that addresses the current risk quantification need of the industry. And since climate is a topic that got talked about, let me take climate as an example to highlight how it translates into all these three aspects of building a better business, better life, as well as better solution. So in the current world where climate and climate change is a big risk theme, first of all, as a responsible company, we were one of the early adopters of the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, TCFD standards. And not just we are taking the standard and reporting, but working with the multitude of stakeholders in the ecosystem to set the right standard, to set the right data governance needs, so that the reports that we produce and reports that our stakeholders produce, they have a sustainability, they have a credibility associated with it, right? So we have our own, that's a net zero targets, but we don't restrict ourselves to just our own target, but also work with the suppliers in our network to influence them to also look at a more sustainable, environmental sustainable practice, right? So we consider that as core part of our social engagement. Talked about the better life as the second pillar of our social engagement. Again, climate change is a big theme. I'll just take that example and run it through all the three cases. So with climate change, it's important that communities that we are part of are also better prepared to deal with climate change risk. So recently, we are a large employer and we have a large presence in New York City. So recently, when the governor of New York City was trying to establish a climate school on one of the islands, we were one of the leading partners. So it was not just the money that we were donating, but we believe that we have the science, we have the modeling methodology that will help the society better put a value to the risk and think about managing the risk better. And third is I talked about better solution, and there we use our scientific knowledge data to really actively put a value to the risk and roll that out as a product out to the commercial world outside of Moody's, for them to leverage that product and in step one, understand how are their risks changing as a result of various climate scenarios emerging. And so that by having more credible information, companies would have a better chance to be able to address that, right? So for us, it's all this dimension. Business is not disconnected with being good socially and doing the right thing socially.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alok. And for the audiences, I think it's important to recognize that just listening to our panelists, how many different perspectives we've been able to get on how to look at the S. I think the first one and the most important one is that S is so context specific, and therefore how do we define the context becomes quite crucial as we look at the S component. While Narayan focused on how the traditional people aspect of the people, planet, profit, the 3 Ps are becoming more and more salient in the definition of S, I think Rajesh's perspective on talking about how net impact to particularly communities and other stakeholders becomes an important dimension of S, to all the way to Madhura talking about all of these conversations that are happening on climate, whether it's the just transition discourse or whether it is the climate change adaptation. At the end of the day, it's all about people in all of these contexts. And last but not the least, Alok coming back there to be able to say, using the same climate as an example to talk about what does it mean. Okay? So in some ways, it appears that there are different levels at which S exists. Okay. On that note, I'm going to move to the next question round with the panelists, because one of the things that worries me is that the S has been framed in a net zero mindset. Okay. And I've had a little bit of a struggle with the net zero mindset because it has this idea of balance. Yeah. And it's almost as if that GHG that is produced and the GHG emission that is removed, and the net of it will somehow make our environment relatively more balanced. I'm wondering, given the kind of inequalities that we see around us, given the kind of gaps that we see in access to healthcare, education, given the way labor fragmentation is happening all over the world, when you look at all of this, is the net zero mindset that the investor community is adopting on S the way forward? If it is net impact, then do organizations know how to measure? Do rating agencies and advisory firms know how to capture the impact? And how do we define the impact? All of these big questions. So please feel free, and maybe we will start with Rajesh, go to Narayan, and then go to Alok, and finally come back to Madhuri. Over to you, Rajesh.
Thanks for the thing. So, see, when it comes to the S component, the obvious culprits are the employee well-being, diversity, and inclusion. So I would move away from that. I would focus more on what we do beyond. Okay. So let's talk about supply chain practices. Like for a large organization like us, we have the responsibility to ensure that our supply chains uphold the highest social standards. So how do we do that? We do that by conducting very rigorous due diligence and collaborating with suppliers to ensure that our supply chain adheres to the highest ethical and responsible practices. For example, at Coca-Cola, we use something called as the SGP, or the Supplier Guiding Principles. So that's the protocol to audit our operations, as well as our bottling partners and our tier 1 suppliers. And we conducted around 2,700 SGP audits last year, and just to ensure that the S component is held to the highest ethical standards. Moving on, if you want to look at community engagement, meaningful community engagement goes beyond writing checks to charities. It involves actively listening to the local stakeholders, understanding their needs, and working collaboratively to address them. Our stated mission of the organization is to make a difference in communities around the world by investing in transformative ideas and institutions that address some of our most pressing global challenges. I will take a couple of examples. Water or water stewardship has been since a long time has been a business imperative for Coca-Cola, because that's one of the biggest ingredients for us. So this strategic framework focuses on reducing shared water challenges, improving the health of priority watersheds, and enhancing community water resilience. Coca-Cola is committed to improving the lives of marginalized communities in water-stressed areas of the country. For example, the Coca-Cola India Foundation, which we lovingly call as Anandana, primarily focuses on areas that are drought-prone, areas of water security concerns, and areas that should be compact and contiguous to sustain replication of programs. Through meaningful partnerships with our bottling partners, NGOs, civil society organizations. So our outreach only in the state of Rajasthan has been almost like 2 lakh people. So that's the kind of work we are looking at. Similarly, packaging is an important component for us. Okay, so we have something called as the World Without Waste, which focuses on 3 key elements. And the first one is the design element, to ensure that all our packaging is actually recyclable. We also have targets to ensure that we avoid usage of virgin resin for our PET packaging. We have a global target on that. The second part is towards collection, where we have a globally stated ambition of saying that by 2030, we will collect and recycle an equivalent of every package that we put into the ground to the consumers, post-consumer. Okay. Now, when we talk about collection, if we take the case of India, you know that there is a huge existing ecosystem of waste workers. So when you actually try to collect back the packages, you are actually touching the lives of those waste pickers. And that is where the majority of the work or the investment goes, to ensure that these marginalized sections of the society actually get access to government schemes, to whatever support we can provide in terms of awareness raising, education, and bringing them in connect to these government schemes. So I could quote many more examples like that, but I know the time is short, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thanks very much. Thank you so much. And let's listen to Narayan.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the reasons I really enjoy being part of academic events like this, and particularly of yours, is that it brings out many dimensions of the truth as it, you know, should be looked at. And Vasanthi, I think the way you framed it is absolutely bang on. So let me just sort of try to weave together a few of the, let's say, paradoxes and dilemmas that we face, both as practitioners as well as those who, as you know, sort of thinking on all this from a larger perspective. One, of course, as you mentioned, you know, the usage of the word net and net zero, you know, implies a certain calculus or arithmetic to it, which even in the environment space is not free of controversy. Okay, I mean, there are continuing debates on, you know, what is really the meaning of carbon neutral versus net zero. That is, of course, one. But take a simple example from our own company. We 60% of our energy footprint is renewable energy. we are going to be 100% renewable by 2030. So about 115 million units of renewable energy we procured last year, which is all very good. I must, make a overarching statement here saying that in the last 10, 15, 20 years, corporations across, including, large corporations like us and others, have made enormous strides on all of this. But the caveat here is, how do you contextualize this against the larger picture of what is happening in the world, right? So going back to, our example, so we are 60% renewable energy and we will be 100% by 2030. What does that actually mean in the larger context? The fact of the matter is, in a country like India, which is coal intensive, the fact that I and few other companies are buying so much of renewable energy is not helping switch off that coal power station running there. So the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere have not reduced because I'm buying 100 million units of renewable energy, right? At best, you can say that at a certain tipping point, when you have a critical mass of procurement of renewable energy, it will help avoid building more future thermal power plants. That's all you can speculate and say. As of today, Wipro cannot claim that I have contributed to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, because that is not true, right? So net zero for Wipro is not net zero for society. Okay, so that's one. And therefore, when you come to the social space, it's even more murky and even more fuzzy, right? I mean, where is the whole concept of netting out something? It just it's like saying that I will be very inclusive and diverse. I will run my factories on green energy. I will do all of that, but my products may be something which may not be of benefit to society. So, as somebody said, you're selling a red product in a very green way, right? And I think, I remember one of the thinkers on this whole sustainable development saying, at best, a company can say that I have contributed to making the world less unsustainable, not I have contributed to making the world more sustainable. Moving from 4 to 5 is also +1. Moving from -5 to -4 is also +1. But the dimensions of the +1 movement is very different. When you're on the negative part and you're just moving up, and when you're on the positive part. At best, I think, companies like us can say that we are contributing in some way to making the world less inequitable, less unsustainable, not the other way around. So therefore, I think it is good to sort of try to qualify your impacts and say what are those impacts actually. But it is important to juxtapose that in the larger context of what is happening in society around, right? So I can say that I'm working in 10 slums in Delhi and have contributed to improving access to primary healthcare, impacting the lives of, say, 100,000 people. That's all very good, but please contextualize this in terms of what it actually means, right?
Thanks, Narayan. Thanks. And I think the fact that these paradoxes continue to plague us and all of us try to navigate them, I think also contributes in some way to the way we think about things. Madhura, over to you. Or Alok, would you like to, maybe I'll flip it over and ask Alok to join coming now.
Yeah, sure. So, no, very, very good commentary from Rajesh and Narayan. As a business, we essentially develop product and solutions relying on the intellectual property of our employees, right? The intellectual capacity of our employees, right? We are not heavy natural resource consuming industry. And as such, I really believe that as a business, we are net contributing positively to the society at large, right? Why do I say that? Well, we are hiring people, we are paying them good salary, we are generally, through our activities of business, through our employees, through contribution to society, we are making things better. We are not making things worse. And in the current environment of focus also on sustainability and climate. When companies like us go out and say, hey, we want to have a net zero target within a certain time horizon, that's even amplifying the positive impact, right? So we were unconsciously, subconsciously 5-10 years ago, traveling all over the place, consuming or releasing more carbon in the atmosphere, and we are toning that down. And where we are not able to tone that down, we are taking other corrective actions, which is helping or which is releasing less of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, right? So I believe just by our business activity relying on the intellect of the human being, we are making a net positive impact. So for me, net zero and net positive social impact, they go hand in hand, right? It's like also by net zero activities, companies are contributing positively to this society at large. So that's all that I would make as a comment.
Thank you so much. And let's listen to Madhura.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting conversation. I will just try to bring a slightly different perspective. So, see, I mean, when we started off with the idea of net zero, or even if you look at the history of our country, you know, we have always focused more on environment, less on society. The simplest reason behind this is easy to monitor environmental performances. We have a lot of matrices to monitor. Whereas in society, we have so many matrices, there is no one such indicator, right? So that has been one of the driving points for all the, you know, whether it's government or private sector. But, you know, I mean, as I was telling earlier also, it's very difficult to achieve an environmental goal without achieving a social goal. You know, I was working in Jharkhand, I'll give an example. And there the whole objective was to help the community find out alternate sources of income because agricultural yield was declining because of drought situation and many other erratic rainfall and all. But what we did first, you know, while we were trying to find out alternate sources of income for the women there, we found out that they do not have bank accounts. They do not have rights to land. How will you help them with alternate livelihood if they do not have the basic rights? So we had started with that part, you know, that they need to have bank accounts so that they know how much they're earning through alternate sources. So see, we went there to do something about environment, but we ended up doing something for the society. But now you can ask that what should be then the indicator for this? You know, is it, more incremental income for the women, or is it number of women holding bank accounts? So there are so many ways, and to reflect social changes that it's sometimes becomes very difficult in a world where we are so much focused on disclosure. You know, we are always focused on disclosure, how to disclose action. So it's more important to take action than to disclose. Disclosure is important, but we have to take action first, you know. Yeah. So that has been I think the core problem when we weigh between environment and society. You know, so that's one thing. And second thing is when we again talk about net zero and net impact, in a country like India, where I was mentioning, it's very difficult to come out of coal. So what do we do? You know, we are not really, reducing the, atmospheric load of CO2. What do we do? We have a, huge landmass of, I would say degraded land. We can plant trees there. We can do that. You know, we can sequester carbon. But in order to do that, you need to engage with the local community. You can't plant trees and maintain them without engaging the local community. So everywhere, wherever we actually have to do something which is long lasting with greater impact, you need community intervention. And the community has to be, we need to, the community has to be sustainable first. They need to have land rights. They need to have rights first. Then only we can save the environment. So this is how, we perceive it, as I would say consultants.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think I want to pick from Narayan's paradoxes. I think that's a great way to frame today's conversation. And it's just incredible when you have panelists like you, the kind of perspectives that come in, because we are grappling with paradoxes, and these paradoxes seem to be multifold. And I just want to pick 3 or 4 of them. There are paradoxes across which stakeholders to prioritize. There's Rajesh started with saying, beyond employees, here is the supply chain that we are looking at, water stressed areas, marginalized communities, which stakeholder do we prioritize and how do we actually navigate? Because satisfying one stakeholder could actually could worsen another stakeholder's responsibilities. The second kind of paradox that I'm left with, and I loved the way Alok framed it, when he turned around and said that I think net zero is a good starting point, because what it has actually provoked us to do is to look at metrics. And he said that has resulted in behavioral changes. So in some ways, what gets measured gets managed. So if net zero is the starting point of looking at it, and if it can change individual behaviors in the way we think about air travel, isn't that as important as looking at net impact as we kind of engage in something? And the other piece that kind of stood out for me is Madhura's call and also Alok's earlier comments, which is really that if E and S are so intricately involved, and it raises a very important question for all of us who are dominantly framing from an environment lens, and I'll come from there, which is really, how then do I view the social in the environmental? And if you're coming from a dominant social lens, you're going to ask, what's the foreground? The foreground is S, but where's the background? Is it the E and the G? So in some ways, what we are seeing is a complex problem. And possibly the definition of the S is getting stuck because we are trying to solve a complex problem with simple linear solutions. And on that note, I'm going to come to the third question, and I hope we have some time for the questions that are coming in, which is that in your assessment, what can we do more to just move the needle on S? Let me begin with Narayan.
I think companies, when they sort of reflect on this and frame goals, KPIs, and narratives, around ES and G, the language used, the way they sort of interconnect the different dimensions, and the way they sort of articulate the narrative can make a crucial difference in what they end up doing, how they engage with different stakeholders, and so on. Let's take the classic, gender diversity dimension, which is, today so, let's say, common across all organizations, right? Now, I remember the early years, there was this debate around whether you should have targets for gender diversity or not. I mean, the debate even continues even today, because the argument for not rushing into targets at that point of time was, if you get into a target more, you might end up sidestepping and diluting some of the core work that an organization needs to do, to make it, more, let's say, gender sensitive, and make a difference where it truly matters. I mean, we know all that, returning mothers, certain stages of the life cycle where, attrition of women is more, what can companies do and all that, right? But I've seen the trajectory move in the direction where today, because of frameworks like, BRSR or DJSI and all of that, more companies have gender targets than not, right? Now, for companies, including us, we've also adopted that. But I think what is important is to look under the hood of that overarching target of, say, I'll move from 36 to 50%, in the next 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. You must break it down into, for example, what is the spread of, gender across levels, number one. Number two, you must look at different life cycles as to what is the attrition rate 12 months after, mother's return, and those kind of things, right? And of course, the more fuzzy part of it. At the end of the day, what is the culture and what are the values of the organization that encourage diversity, not just from gender or from a nationality or from whatever, but from the perspective of being able to voice different opinions, from the perspective of being able to voice dissent constructively, and not allowing unconscious biases or otherwise to sort of rule the paradigm there and so on. So I think if companies take care to articulate all of this in a level of detail that of course is quantitative, but also brings in some of these nuances in its holistic aspect, then it can really make a difference to the way people can be embedded as part of the entire spectrum, ESG, from within the organization to outside. I mean, climate change is not only about what you do inside the company on renewable energy, but what you do outside in the city for app delivery workers, the Zomato workers of the world, who during the hot Indian summer, can you do CSR work on, let's say, transit shelters that provide them some space to take rest and so on, right? So I think it is the way you sort of weave everything together and narrate it, with the right intermix of numbers and articulation that can make a difference.
Yeah. Thanks, Narayan. Over to you, Rajesh.
Yeah. So, Vasanta, you said it's a very complex problem. We should and all of that, but in terms of what we can do more in this, I think we should simplify it first. In terms of we should play to our strengths rather than play to our weaknesses. Like if I quote the example of Coca-Cola, the first thing that comes to your mind is that fizzy drink of Coca-Cola, right? But you might not even know that we are one of the largest procurers of mango in the country because of our brand Maza. And that brand has got the biggest brand numbers in this country. So that leads us to not the product, but the people who actually cultivate the mangoes and what we can do over there. And we have been working in that field for the past almost like 11 years. We started off with the project, something called this Project Unnati. And then we evolved it into a much larger concept called as the food circular economy, where rather than limiting ourselves to our core ingredient, which is the mango, we expanded it into many more foods. Like, for example, we brought apples into Uttarakhand. Nobody would have guessed that apples could be grown in the plains of Uttarakhand. And as we speak today, Uttarakhand is the third largest producer of apples in the country. And how did we do that? We partnered. We brought in the right people into the play, and we gave them the right planting material, and we gave them demo orchards to prove the proof of the point, right? And as we speak today, our outreach is almost across 11 states, and we have touched the lives of almost 3.5 lakh farmers. And that's playing to our strength. So I think we as responsible organizations, we should see where we can operate in a comfort zone, but do better more work in that area. So that's all I would say.
Thank you, Rajesh. Maybe we will listen to Madhura and then have Alok having the last word.
I think Rajesh has paved the path for me. That's what I was going to say. I mean, the very simple thing, companies are definitely, putting effort around CSR, corporate social responsibility. But if you look at it, currently the CSR programs for most of the corporates are not aligned with the overall environmental or climate goals of their own goals and the country's goals. I mean, most of the CSR programs are about donating, to a fund, doing an educational program. While all those are extremely, important, but are we aligning our social programs with the, climate imperatives or environmental imperatives? Because companies are carrying out environmental risk assessment, they are carrying out climate risk assessment. But if you look at their programs, they're away from, very much away from the environmental goals. Once these two merge with each other, then we will have a more meaningful CSR program for corporates. So that is how I would describe. That's the priority. That's the importance.
Great, great. Thank you, Madhura. And Alok?
So, Professor, your question was what can be done to make a difference on the S aspect of the ESG. I firmly believe that what gets measured gets done, right? Look at the climate goals, net zero goal. There are many holes one can poke in the goals and the targets and the way they are set up, whether 2050 is the right time horizon or should be 2030. You can poke many holes. But when a target got set, the level of awareness increased, right? There were lots of actions that started to get taken. Now we can debate whether they're enough. And I don't believe we live in a perfect world, so there will never be enough. We could all do more. But as the goals, as the numbers, as the target got set, things started to move, right? And similarly, I believe that we would see a significant change when we go more numeric on some of the S-related goals, going beyond diversity and inclusion, and that would require companies, corporates themselves, but also data providers like us, consultants like where Madhura is working at. So it will require all of us to put our focus on collecting the data, on putting the metrics, and then also then correlating the metrics with the financial impact, right? Because businesses will act and put in disproportionate resources only when they would see that some of the actions is resulting also on a significant impact on the financials of the company, right? And on the diversity side, I believe the reason it gets talked about so much is there have also been statistics, correlation shown, right? The famous one that says Fortune 500 companies with women as CEO have tended to perform significantly better, even on the stock market, compared to the average, right? So these kind of statistics, correlation numbers helps to drive the right behavior. And I really believe it's about time that we move towards putting metrics and measuring them even if they're not perfect.
Great. So let me just summarize the 6 things that have come from all of you. I think starting from saying, are we aligning the programs that we do, CSR programs, to looking at the SDG goals that have been committed at a national level and the other goals at an international level? And then we are talking about how do we measure the S more appropriately? And if we put in a little more effort to looking at the various dimensions of measuring S, we may not have the kind of problems that we have today. The third aspect of it, which I think Narayan brought out, is that the role of language in framing the issues. And if we use the language, what is the language that is appropriate to social? Because social is about social change. So what's the language, and can it be substituted by the G or the E rhetoric? Then, of course, the whole idea of how do you nuance how S relates to different aspects of the organization, which Rajesh followed up by saying, just simplify, play to your strengths. But one theme that's come right across is the idea of collaboration, that no way can we do it alone, and that multiple people have to come together. And I think SDGs in its last goal was intending to do that. But how do we do it across and within goals to be able to move the needle on S? Couple of comments that are there latent, and I'm going to just surface them and not necessarily answer them before I hand over for the questions, is that today the ESG conversation is becoming important, but is driven by investors. And investors' orientation to an S in normal parlance does not align in many ways to the S as is seen by the development agenda goals. And therefore, how do we broker and manage those tensions? The second one is, what is materiality when we look at the S dimension, and whose materiality are we talking about? And last but not the least, I want to pick on Narayan's +1 on this side or that side. Are we measuring enough of do no harm before we go and look at do good? And if we have to look at do no harm, are disclosures allowing us to say anything about the do no harm on the S dimension? And last but not the least, should we, for ensuring that S becomes deeper, move from the language of stakeholder to rights holder? Whose rights are we infringing? Whose rights are we violating? Is that the conversation and starting point for the rights perspective? Thank you so much to this wonderful panelists, and I hand over Padmini for the questions that are there that come in from the audience.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions, but I'll pick on one or two which are very, very important for this discussion. The first one is there are a whole lot of MSMEs in the country. So how do we engage MSMEs? Because large corporates anyway have a lot of fun to do this. So how do we engage MSMEs? So that's one of the questions, either to any of the panelists or
Rajesh may be able to answer it because their supply value chains are all SMEs.
Not actually. We have a large chunk of people who are large corporations, but yes, we do engage with MSMEs, and like I was mentioning earlier, the SGP or the supplier guiding principles. that's a starting point to ensure that these MSMEs actually imbibe the principles of larger organizations like us. So in a way, we are passing on the baton to them and ensuring that they do have that in their way of working. Okay, that's an important aspect.
Oh.
And there are when you talk about ingredients, we talk about sustainably sourced ingredients, which means that for them to be sustainably sourced, they have to be certified. So, for example, sugar, we are talking about a born sucrose, which means that there is an element of human rights element in that, which has to be necessarily implied with. And something similar, we are working with respect to the waste sourcing when we talk about PET. So that's my short answer.
Another interesting question is, how do we change the mindset of people? You know, because they are amongst the people, they are amongst the group that also are not exactly aware of net zero and our targets and so on, but also contribute to, you know, violation of many things. Yeah. Larger change in the mindset, change in, you know, some metrics for nudging people of this country to, you know, think about these aspects.
That's a hard one to answer, right? It's about changing people's people preferences is always difficult. I do believe the level of awareness and knowledge about things like climate change and the impact on our life is increasing, right? People are seeing what's happening right now in this country, in the northern part, with flood and changing frequency of flood there.
Yeah.
And these are the right moment to nudge people through campaigns, through educational initiative, to do something about also reducing their personal carbon footprint and not just rely on somebody doing something for the society at large.
Great. You want to comment anything, Vasanthi?
No, not particularly. I think I think the point I want to close with is saying that possibly because S is at so many different levels, right? Just, I think as companies, when you're visualizing S, not only to see the linkages with the other parts, but also how to deconstruct it so that the last employee is able to understand what their role is, both at a corporate level as well as an individual level. I think that's the kind of education that we will need if we have to change mindsets. So that was an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. I think we have time for only this last question, which is about what do you think is the role of government? Is it enough? Do you think they should be engaged more in this? There are a lot of schemes that are available already for the S part. I mean, do government need to do more on this, or what's your view on this? I mean, that's a very big piece. Yeah.
And
Yeah, anyone on the panel? Yeah, Narayan, over to you.
No, I think companies in general, Indian companies in particular, respond much more to regulation than to voluntary action, right? We've seen that. We've seen that both in the case of the CSR law and more recently in the case of the SEBI mandate on ESG, on PRSR, right? I think in some ways it is good. I mean, the fact that SEBI mandates 1,000 largest companies by market cap to report on a whole host of things that they would have otherwise not thought of is a good thing. The only, I would say the only qualifying factor to that would be that the crossover point should be kept watch on very carefully. It should not be a case of it, becoming prescriptive or punitive. Both of them will not work with companies. If it becomes punitive, then everybody then goes into a shell. They'll just start checking the boxes and so on, right? So I think the SEBI BRR or the BRSR now is a good example of how regulation can actually induce change, especially in some of these more intractable areas like human rights. Right? Of course, there will be differences between company to company in terms of whether they do that in the true spirit of it or just as a compliance measure. But yes, at least there are 1,000 more companies who now know that these are important issues.
Okay. I think with that we would like to wind up. Any last comments and before I give my closing?
Yeah, Padmini, I think just building on what Narayan said, right? I think we have to look at self-regulation by companies, and we have to look at co-regulation by industry associations, and we need to look at public regulation by the government. I think if all these three regulatory mechanisms are used, I think it's only then that we can kind of look at managing this more complex issues in society.
Thanks for that. Wonderful. As I gathered, 2-3 points, in terms of what we have discussed, and this is my takeaway, that is to look at, as a rights perspective or as a justice perspective, justice for all, rights for all. So you put that lens and look at it. And the second is also to ensure that, all the stakeholders come together. Only then we can achieve our net zero or other goals. So we have to work together. It's not just corporates or government or so on. We all have to come together to achieve this. So that's my second take on this. Thanks for the wonderful insights. I'm sure all our participants have really gained from this deeper, more complex subject, in terms of measurement, how do we implement, and so on. And thanks, Narayan, Rajesh, Alok, Madhura, and of course, Vasanthi for moderating this panel. Thanks, of course, to CCGS, Greta, and Ganeshan. As usual, they are the pillars of support to this webinars. Thanks once again to all the participants and for their questions. Because of lack of time, we have not taken all of them. We have taken a few questions. So thanks once again. Please join us for the next webinar as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.